Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called Jazz Rock and Vocals with a question mark after it. So what's this about? Well, this comes up when I chat with fans of jazz rock fusion, and it's been mentioned a couple of times over at the Sea of Tranquility when I've been on there, and it's the amount of jazz rock albums that are ruined by vocals, often when the musician themselves decides to try and sing. You know, I think there's some pretty terrible examples that are on maybe Stanley Clarke albums or Aldo Meola albums where there's been the thought that, you know, by adding a vocal to this album it's going to make it really, really commercial and they're going to sell a ton of records, but in fact it's just an awful piece of music, you know. So many albums are ruined in this genre by the addition of vocals. But there are lots of examples in jazz rock fusion where I think the vocals are essential and fantastic or interesting. There's also some musicians, you know, that singers that are really important in this genre that I haven't spoken about. So I thought I'd come up with 10 albums which have that we could call jazz rock fusion albums that have vocals on. This is a really interesting idea. So, and they're all different. I'm not saying they're the definitive albums with vocals on. I think all these do different things, and I'm going to get into them as we go. But also, I am going to pick one which I think is the great jazz rock fusion album with vocals, and I think people will be surprised by that. So let's just start straight off with an album like this. Flora Purim, Butterfly Dreams. Okay, this is from, I think, around about 1973, that's right. Look at the lineup on here. Flora Purim on vocals, Joe Henderson on flute, George Duke on piano, Dave Amaro on electric acoustic guitars, Ernie Hunt, zither, Stanley Clarke electric and acoustic bass, and Airto on drums and percussion. So with Flora, Airto and Stanley, this is almost like the original Return to Forever album. Lineup. And there is a version of Light as a Feather on here as well. But it's an interesting lineup with George Duke in there as well. So who's Flora Purim? Flora Purim, for me, is the great jazz fusion singer. She's got this incredible range of, I think, over 5 octaves. And she scats, but she scats in a really interesting way, not like Sarah Vaughan or Ella Fitzgerald. She was the wife of Airto, and she has that Latin American influence in her voice, and I think her voice is fantastic. I know a lot of people think that she sort of diminishes the early Return to Forever albums. I don't think she does. I think she's an absolutely virtuoso musician who is able to really create one of the distinctive jazz fusion sounds, which is her voice. I think of her albums, this is the one to go for, is Butterfly Dreams. It's always been my favourite one. I've only got a few, but this is the one I really like. It's from the key, you know, period of jazz fusion when jazz fusion ruled the world, and it's an incredible lineup and there's some great stuff on this album. So there's an example of a musician, a singer that's come out of the jazz rock fusion genre that I think is really important to the sound. You know, there's other musicians like this. If I just start to go through the records I've got, so here's another musician I think is really, really important. Is Gail Moran. Gail Moran was the keyboardist with the Mavish Orchestra. She then went on to, you know, perform in the last incarnation, the sort of big band version of Return to Forever. And she's worked on a lot of Chick Corea albums, and of course she eventually married Chick Corea. This is one of the great jazz fusion albums, and vocals are integral. You know, Gail Moran's vocals on this album are integral. I'm sure there's many people which would prefer this without vocals. This is what I'm really trying to bring up here. But for me, that incredible, on Leprechaun's Dream, when it opens, that incredible choir of Gail, you know, that opens it up, and it's this sort of fanfare of voices, is absolutely, it's just one of the great moments. Her vocal on Lenore, Lenore is absolutely beautiful tune, and if you listen to what the musicians are doing, they do not compromise in any way whatsoever. So I would say that Gail Moran is another voice that's so important to so many jazz fusion albums, integral. So jazz fusion has produced a few singers that are really, really important. Later on, you know, towards the 80s and 90s, there's two other singers that I want to bring in here. The first one is Cassandra Wilson. Cassandra Wilson was the voice of M-Bass. And Cassandra Wilson is a really incredible singer. The album I pulled out is this one, because I think it's the most relevant to this channel. It's called Travelling Miles. And it's basically her singing Miles Davis tunes and interpreting them in a really interesting way. If you're a Miles fan, this is well worth checking out. So she opens up with a tune called Run the Voodoo Down, which is sort of, it's not Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, but it's very similar. And then you get Time After Time, Seven Steps, Someday My Prince Will Come, and also other tunes like Right Here, Right Now, Sun Goes Down, a song called Never Broken, which is based upon ESP. It's a really interesting interpretation of Miles's music and shows how a modern jazz singer can work within the sort of jazz rock, jazz fusion style. This is a really, really interesting album, and she's something else, and she's well worth checking out in the M-Bass. So these are two new singers I'm covering. The second singer I want to talk about is, of course, the incredible Bobby McFerrin. And I was going to pull out Simple Pleasures, which contains, you know, Don't Worry, Be Happy, which is, of course, is one of the biggest songs culturally in history. You know, my kids know that song. Bobby McFerrin's incredible. He's had a #1, but he really is an incredible musician that can work within a jazz rock fusion band or with an orchestra, or even just on his own. I think Bobby McFerrin is one of the greatest musicians on the planet, and I really wanted to talk about him on this channel. The album I've actually pulled up to have a listen to him on is this, Sporting Life, right? His wordless vocals here integrate into Weather Report like another instrument. You know, so some of the tracks on here, you might think that there's like sort of some strange slap bass going on, but it's Bobby McFerrin. You know, it's so interesting how he integrates it. He's not at the forefront of this album, but it's a really interesting example of how a virtuoso musician can integrate themselves, virtuoso singer can integrate themselves within a music ensemble and not be the lead singer and not doing backing vocals, but doing something completely different. So yeah, you know, there's a number of singers. So, you know, Flora Purim, Gail Moran, you know, Bobby McFerrin, Cassandra Wilson. These are the singers that have been produced by this genre. But also this genre has influenced a number of different groups. In the early 70s, Santana, right? They really are a jazz fusion band, but they don't give up on the vocals. So this is one of the great vocal jazz fusion bands of all time. On this, we've got a whole bunch of singers, including Flora Purim, but we also have the great, if I can just find which track he's on. It's When I Look Into Your Eyes, isn't it? So it's really hard to, my eyesight is so bad. Sorry, Yours Is the Light, right? Yours Is the Light features Flora Purim on vocals, again, one of the great jazz fusion singers, but also on whistling, Leon Thomas. You know, I wanted to represent Leon Thomas on here. Leon Thomas is the incredible yodeling singer that was a member of Santana. He's actually on the Lotus album. And he's on this album as well. I'm sure he's on a couple of the other tracks as well. He also sang with Pharoah Saunders, and I think Leon Thomas needs a mention as well. It's not quite the jazz fusion genre, but I think his time in Santana gives him his jazz fusion credentials. So actually, jazz fusion, the instrumental form of jazz fusion, has produced some utterly incredible singers. But it goes the other way, right? How do we deal with this? Okay, is this jazz fusion? All right. Isn't this an example of the influence jazz fusion has had on contemporary music? This, of course, is Steely Dan, Asia. It's a multi-million selling album. Okay. But is it a jazz fusion album? Is it that we're not perceiving it as a jazz fusion album because there's vocals all over, because it's songs? But anyone that has listened to the track Asia will know that they blow. Wayne Shorter blows on there. Steve Gadd does a big solo all the way through that. That is out and out jazz fusion. You know, the guitar solos that you hear on here have come out, you know, Larry Carlton and Jay Graydon, the people doing the solos on these sort of albums, they're coming out of jazz fusion. I would argue that this is a jazz fusion album. But the vocals are so preeminent and the songwriting so great that we don't perceive it like that. Another example of that would be this. Songs in the Key of Life, Stevie Wonder. You know, I could have pulled many Stevie Wonder albums out. I believe that Stevie Wonder is making jazz fusion. I think you could, if you pulled the vocals off, it would be an instrumental jazz fusion album. I think they would stand up. Of course, this album has got Contusion, and it's actually got a fusion tune on there that gets mentioned, you know, so often. Oh yeah, that, you know, Stevie Wonder made a fusion track. I would say the whole album is indebted and very informed by jazz fusion, you know. So when you add vocals in a certain way, you know, when you're not doing that Leon Thomas, Flora Purin way of singing, you know, when you add the vocals in a really capable way with a good song behind it, you know, does it become something else? Is Off the Wall by Michael Jackson, is that a fusion album with vocals on? Are the Shaka Khan albums fusion albums? You know, that is so informed by this genre. Okay, now I've left the two albums that I really wanted to talk about to the end. All right, and this first one is probably going to be a shock to some of you, but I think these two, I would say, would be these are the essential jazz fusion albums with vocals on. So the first is this, Manhattan Transfer, Extensions. Okay, this is not my album, it was my dad's album. When I got into music and I was listening to like metal and prog, I looked around his collection and he had a Billy Cobham album, and that set me on the path towards fusion. But he also had this album. Now this album, is it a fusion album? Well, what's interesting on here is it's got a version of Birdland on here by Weather Report, where all the significant parts have been replaced by Manhattan Transfer's vocals, including Joe Zawinul's incredibly fast and fluid legato-y type solo right at the end of Birdland. Janice Siegel actually sings that note to note with lyrics, you know, so the virtuosity on this album is absolutely incredible, and the breadth of styles that they cover is incredible. So I picked this up as a very young, like 11, 12-year-old. My dad's Manhattan Transfer record, and I thought, well, let's check this out. You know, it wasn't my thing, but I thought, check it out. And I stuck my headphones on and I tried to play through it, and I hit Birdland, and that was a learning curve. But also on here, you've got tracks like Wacky Dust, which is a sort of 1930s jazz swing track. You've got Nothing You Can Do About It, which is a sort of Toto-esque halftime shuffle swing. Coco Yo, which is like a electronic experimental track. Then you have Body and Soul, which is a reworking of the Coleman Hawkins tune again, you know, with this method of taking Coleman Hawkins solo and turn it into a vocal. It's called Vocalese. It was really pioneered by Lambert, Hendricks and Ross, which were a vocal duo in the 50s, and they take jazz standards and, you know, transcribe the solos and then turn them into vocals by adding lyrics, and that was very influential on the Manhattan Transfer. On side 2, you have a tune called Twilight Zone, Twilight Tone. There's 2 tracks. That again is an out and out fusion track, really plugging into the TV show Twilight Zone. I absolutely love this album. Then there's a sort of rock and roll track called Trickle Trickle. Then you get the Shaker song, and the Shaker song is sort of like a Spira Gyra Latin-esque, with Alex Acuna on, you know, full out Latin jazz fusion track. And it ends with a tune called Foreign Affair, which is, I think it's a Tom Waits tune, so I'm not too sure. Shall we check that out? Because I don't want to give you false information. Foreign Affair. Of course, it doesn't tell me at all. You can tell me, but I think it's a cover version by somebody like Tom Waits. I'm not too sure. But yeah, this is a fantastic vocal album. If you really want to listen to virtuoso vocals in a jazz fusion setting, get this album and have a listen to Birdland. But the whole album is absolutely fantastic, right? But this leaves me now with what I think is the great jazz fusion vocal album of all time. And it's one of the greatest albums ever made, in my opinion as well. And if you're a jazz fusion fan and you don't own this, you need to go and get a copy now, or go and listen to a copy now, and it's this. Now this is Melodies by the Jan Hammer Group. So Jan Hammer, after he leaves the Mavish Orchestra, he does a sort of, almost like his version of Tubular Bells, where he's playing everything on it, in an album called The First 7 Days. Before that, he'd made an album with Jerry Goodman, called Like Children, and these are all really indebted to the Mavish Orchestra. He takes the sound, he moves it on. Now, in my recent essential albums of the jazz rock fusion genre, I put an album in. The only sort of unknown album I put in was an album by him called Oh Yeah, and I think it's one of the great fusion albums. He follows it up with this. Now, I think this band at that time, albeit brilliant, were not selling records. And so Jan decides to do the very thing I talked about at the beginning of this video. He decides to make an album where he and the other members of the band attempt to sing, right? As Stanley Clarke has done, as Al Di Meola done, you know, even Herbie Hancock with his vocoder. They've all tried it with varying degrees of success. But on this, they sit down and they write an album of songs. And they're all singing on it. And they all, you know, I think Jan Hammer's singing on here, Tony Smith's singing on here, Stephen Kindler's singing on here, and the majority of the lead vocals is handled by the great Fernando Saunders, I think. He's listed as lead vocals, but they're all singing, right? This should be a disaster. It really is not. It's one of the greatest fusion albums there is, in my book. The production and the sound's incredible. The songwriting is absolutely incredible, and it goes from sort of Stevie Wonder sort of funk to folk to out and out fusion to psychedelic. It's really incredible. On side 2, there's a track called Don't You Know. I think that Don't You Know is my favourite produced track there is. At college, when I lecture on production, one of the first tunes I play them is Don't You Know. What Jan Hammer did with the production is just unbelievable when you listen to that track and the way it sits. There's some incredible moments on here. There's a track called Peaceful Sundown, which starts, it's a full-on song, and it starts this very mellow and low, and it chunks along, right? And it's a beautiful song, but when you listen to it, you notice that it's all sort of over the one side of the stereo field. You know, it still sounds great, but you know, it's very low and over this one side. And then suddenly halfway through, they just explode into jazz fusion. And this other side just opens up. I think it's one drum kit, and then they bring in a second drum kit. Jan Hammer's one of the great drummers. He's one of my favourite drummers. Tony Smith's one of my favourite drummers. But on here, you get them both. I'm really, you know, plugging this album for you. There's a track called Just for Fun. And Just for Fun is about playing jazz fusion. This is the lyrics. They tackle the very thing this video is about jazz fusion with vocals. They make a sort of funny song about there. And then you get a track called Who Are They? Who Are They starts off as a song, and it's about people who criticise people, especially in this genre. It's quite a nice, interesting song, very Mahavishnu-y, but a song. And then Jan plugs into an extended keyboard solo. It's my favourite keyboard solo by Jan Hammer. It's one of my favourite keyboard solos ever. It just all comes together. It's absolutely incredible. So yes, this is my essential jazz rock fusion album with vocals that actually breaks the rules, you know, where they're singing the vocals. These non-singing, you know, jazz fusion musicians actually pull the mic out and write some songs. Jan Hammer had a pop sensibility, you know. He goes on the 80s and, you know, starts doing the soundtrack to Miami Vice, and starts having hit records, and, you know, creates a sound which is really, really important culturally in terms of 80s music. You know, he's got a pop ear, which I think is why this album works, but it starts here. Anyway, that's my video on jazz rock fusion vocals. If you like it, like it. If you want to subscribe, subscribe. And if you've got some ones you want to put in, you know, please mention them. If you do count up the albums I've just covered, you'll find there's 9. And the reason is because another album which I think is essential, which I don't have a copy of, is Look at the Rainbow by Al Jarreau. What can I say? So, you know, and where he does the Take 5 by Dave Brubeck. So that's another album you've got to check out. And that was in my list, but I got so involved in this, I forgot about it. So I have to put it in the end, right at the end of the video. Get it in, just, I'm going to stop now. I can't do it anymore. That's it. I can't keep going on. I'll see you soon on the next video. Thank you very much.